Shabbat Shalom, everybody. So what I'm going to do this Shabbat is I'm going to share with you now a very embarrassing moment in my life. Why am I going to share a very embarrassing thing that happened to me in my life? Because I don't know, because I'm Meshuggah, but I'm going to share it anyway. It happened when I was a kid rabbi, just out of rabbinical school. I was in my first pulpit in Columbus, Ohio, as the assistant rabbi. And it was the Shabbat that comes in the middle of Sukkot. And my job at that synagogue at the time is that every week I was the one who introduced the Torah reading. So that I gave that Devar Torah right at the beginning of the Torah reading, and that was my job. So I got up to introduce the Torah reading, and I am there at the podium holding forth about this week's Parsha. And in the middle of my giving my Devar Torah, suddenly I feel this hand on my shoulder. And I'm stunned, so I stop talking and I look over, and there's my senior rabbi standing right behind me, and he leans over and whispers into my ear, "You're introducing the wrong Parsha." So now I was just starting out. I had a lot to prove. I was really insecure. And at that time, I was still really nervous about public speaking. So I had no idea how to recover from that. I kind of went, I just sort of sputtered. And then I sort of just decided to slink away from the bima. And my senior rabbi took over and introduced the Parsha that week. Gewalt, don't you hate memories like that? Yeah, kind of moments when you know, and even worse than the embarrassing thing of a moment like that is what happens a million billion times over when you go over it in your head again and again and again. It's almost worse than the original time because you can't stop thinking about the embarrassing thing that you did. Oy, why do we do that to ourselves, right? And it's not just about embarrassing moments that we do that to ourselves. We do it on anything about when we regret something, when we make any kind of mistake of any kind, when we let people down. There's this part of us that just kind of gets a hold of us and doesn't let go, and we can't stop ruminating about this. So what I want to do right now is I want to show you what I do in order to deal with that endless rumination over some troublesome memory or some troublesome experience. This is my little technique. And I sort of have this technique, which is something that I kind of call a spiritual / cognitive behavioral technique of dealing with these kinds of moments. What I do is I'm a big journaler. I like to write things down. So I try to isolate the really offensive thought, the thought that's really burning and that's making me ruminate. So in this case, for example, I might write down something like, "I must be an incompetent rabbi because I couldn't even get the Parsha right." Right? And notice I wrote that in the present tense because even though that happened decades ago, if it's still going through my mind, emotionally we experience that as if it's happening in the present moment every single time, over and over. And that's why it's so draining. So I write it down in the present moment. I take a deep breath. I look at what I wrote. And then I try to find a way to write down the exact opposite of that. So for example, in this case, I would write down, "I am a competent rabbi, even if I got the Parsha wrong." And I would write that down, and then I'll sit with that, right? This is where the cognitive behavioral part, right? And then what I do is I try to come up with an example of that. And again, back in time, in those days, right? So I might come up with something like, "Well, I got everything else right that Shabbat. I didn't make any other, egregious, embarrassing mistakes." That's maybe one proof. Or, I was new. I was a rabbi baby. You make mistakes when you're new at this kind of thing. That's another nice thing to put down. And so, and I'll keep going. I'll try to find more proofs, even if it seems immaterial or insignificant. If it's a proof that addresses that, like for example, I might write down, "Well, just the day before, I visited 5 different congregants in the hospital and really was there for them." Or I might write down something like, "You know what? It was the wrong Parsha, but it was a really good Devar Torah," right? So whatever it is, You just want, if you find one, find another, and actually the list can go on and on and on. And I'll tell you, something amazing happens. I have learned over the years that when there is a thought that troubles me, I can never make a thought go away. It's not possible, right? They just come automatically. So, but what I can do is do this little process of garnering proofs of the opposite being true. And something magical happens. As I begin to assimilate the opposite perspective or the broader perspective, that tough, entrenched thought lets go of me. Right? I can't let go of it, but the more I get the perspective on it, the more it seems to magically let go. And the more I find myself in peace and in balance. And I don't expect you to believe me. Try this. If you don't do something like this, try it out. Right? Anything that bugs you, write it down and try to find the proofs of the opposite. And not just one proof, not just two, not just three, even keep going. Try it. See what you, let me know how it goes. In this week's Parsha, we're reading, of course, the story of Joseph and his terrible relationship with his brothers. It says in the Torah that Joseph would bring reports back to his father, Jacob, about all of the doings of his brothers. And of course, that pissed off his brothers even more, and they hated him even more, as I talked about before. And the Sfat Emet has a very interesting teaching about Joseph's talebearing to his father. It says, you know, it was actually good. It was actually important. It was actually bashert that Joseph should be telling stories to his father about his brothers. Why? Because he needed to piss off his brothers, because he needed to be thrown into a pit. He needed to be sold into slavery. He needed to be thrown in jail in Mitzrayim, because only that way could he go through the cauldron, as it were, shaping him into a tzaddik, a righteous human being. Right? Joseph, when we refer to him in Judaism, is called Yosef HaTzadik, Joseph the Tzaddik. He is one of the original tzaddikim, he was one of the great tzaddikim of the Jewish people. But he wasn't always that way. In our Parsha, he is an arrogant, obnoxious little boy. That's what he is. No, he's no tzaddik at all. And then the Sfat Emet has a very beautiful teaching about this. He talks about the nature of what makes a tzaddik. What truly makes a tzaddik? He says a tzaddik is somebody who has this miraculous ability to lift up the good in others. And that's what Yosef became. But he had to go to hell and back in order to become a man who, as the Sfat Emet says, ma'alei rak ma'asehem hakedoshim, somebody who lifts up only people's good deeds. Now think back to what Joseph went through. His brothers were criminals. They threw him into a pit and at first left him to die and then sold him to slavery. It doesn't get any more horrific than that. And then years later, you know, in a couple of parshiot, when these brothers come to him in Egypt and he's Pharaoh's right-hand man, yeah, he seems pretty cruel back to them, but actually he's acting like a tzaddik in the Jewish tradition. He's acting like a tzaddik. Why? Because he is testing them in order to bring out their goodness. He's setting them up to do the right thing. And that is truly the measure of a tzaddik, right? When we reflect on what a tzaddik is, it's not only somebody who can see the good in others, but who actively engages them, either in positive, inspiring ways to get them to do good, or sometimes in difficult ways, in challenging people and in testing them to get them to be their best selves. Well, that's wonderful for a tzaddik, but you might think that's kind of a tall order for you and for me. You know, we live with lots of people who are just rotten people in our lives. We live in a world of all kinds of crazy people, bigots, and people who are out to undo our democracy, all kinds of horrible things in the world that we live in. It's very hard to see the good in everybody. So I guess we're destined not to be tzaddikim, huh? Well, hold on a second. This is why I brought my little personal technique of dealing with self-recrimination that I do with writing down the opposite of a disturbing idea that I got stuck in my head. You see, the reason why I do that is because, you know, I've noticed that when we look around the world, we see lots of people who are absolutely horrible people, people who are worth only horrible judgments by the world. But you know what? I have found both in my own life and in counseling people over years, for most of us, you know who one of the worst, most deplorable people are in the world? It's ourselves. What I mean by that is we spend so much time being horrible to ourselves. We don't even realize it. We automatically castigate ourselves and denigrate ourselves and judge ourselves and reject ourselves. We spend so much time in these negative spirals. And is it any wonder that at some point we're going to start to project that negativity on others and on the world around us? Is it any wonder that, you know, we're just so certain that we're an embarrassment, that we're certain that we're incompetent or that we're worthless? You know, and is it any wonder that if we see somebody else who we think is also an embarrassment or incompetent or worthless, it's almost on some level, maybe it's hard to admit, but on some level it's a relief to find somebody else who's awful, maybe worse than we are, right? And that's a very negative way to live our lives. But the truth is we're all guilty of that. And that's why I have my little personal practice of journaling. Journaling isn't for everybody, but I highly recommend, even if the writing down doesn't work for you, you know, maybe a good therapist or maybe just a good friend who can help you see the other side of things, because we don't realize how often we get stuck in one narrow way of defining ourselves and our lives. And I talk about how this process has a miraculous outcome. And the miraculous outcome is that the negativity, instead of us letting go of it, it somehow dissipates all by itself. And there's an even greater miracle that happens when we engage in this process of seeing past our own perspective. And that greater miracle is, as the negativity lets go of me, I somehow magically perceive less and less negativity about other human beings in the world. As my negative thoughts let go of me, the more potential I have to find the good in others. So you know what? If you want to be a tzaddik, you can be a tzaddik, but you have to start with all of the places inside your mind and in your heart that have you stuck in terrible self-misery and self-suffering and self-recrimination. It begins there. We begin with ourselves. Menachem Nahum of Chernobyl had a very beautiful teaching about the nature of Torah. He talked about Torah in these kind of Platonic terms. He said, you know, what Torah really is, it's not just a scroll. It's not just a book or 5 books. It's actually something that existed before the universe was created. It exists as a kind of perfection at the right hand of God, Torah. And he said, the Torah that we're reading the stories in the Torah because the people, like Joseph, he was commenting on the story of Joseph, Joseph became Torah in his life. In his journey of going from an arrogant kid to a tzaddik, he became the perfection of the Torah. That's how you can have a Torah that Judaism says is perfect, but it's filled with imperfections and filled with imperfect people. Because the journey of Torah is that journey of going from darkness to light, right? Joseph started in darkness, the darkness of his own arrogance. And then somehow after his years in Egypt, he began to see something. He began to see even his own past arrogance and his own past mistakes were for the good, which is why he would someday tell his brothers, you shouldn't be upset that you did what you did. It was for the good. Because if you hadn't done that, if I hadn't had that terrible relationship with you, I would not be able to save life. So this is our task in this moment in history, certainly in this time of healing, and in our own lives, that we have to move from the darkness to the light. That's what Hanukkah is all about. It's one of the basic gestures of our Jewish tradition, one of the greatest gifts that we have in Judaism. You know, Rabbi David Hartman had a beautiful quote about the miracle of Hanukkah. And I love what he taught. He said, yes, we know that the oil lasted for 8 days and that was a miracle because we only expected it to last for 1 day. He said, but the real miracle is that the Jews at that moment, when they only had this 1 cruse of oil, they had the courage and the faith to light it anyway. That's the miracle. The miracle isn't out there in the divine. It lives in our courageous choice to affirm the light despite the overwhelming darkness. I love that. And that's the perfect symbol of tzedek, of what it means to be a tzaddik. It means to look for the light, no matter how seemingly small or insignificant. That's the journey of tzedek, of righteousness and of finding justice in this world. Menachem Nachum of Chernobyl taught it very powerfully that we can all become Torah. Like Joseph, we can go on that journey from darkness to light. So if you look around at the people in your life, or you look around at your world and you are furious, and you see a lot of rotten, horrible people, and you see a terrible, awful, miserable world out there, you can't fix the world. You can't. However, you can start with yourself. In Proverbs, it says, Ner Adonai Nishmat Adam, that the soul of, or the candle of God is the soul of one human being. Start with your own one candle, your one cruise of oil, right? And go inside and find all the places that you have suffering. Thought by thought, turn it around, find the light until one leads to the other, to the other, to the other, until you can light up your whole life. That's what Menachem Nachum is teaching about Joseph. You know, he taught us about the meaning of redemption. He sat in those jails and in that pit, and he had plenty of time to think about his past mistakes, all his dull moments that he might have had in his life. And he turned it around to the good, and something miraculous happened. Over and over again, he miraculously rose out of that pit, and the universe brought him to the height of power in Mitzrayim so that he could save life. That is what you and I can do. We can save life. We can even ultimately save the world if we begin truly with ourselves. So this Hanukkah, may we resolve to find the potential for goodness that lives in all humanity, as difficult as that is, by finding it first in ourselves, because that's the most difficult of all. And in that way, may we become a vessel of healing and of justice for all the world. In other words, the Torah is literally our birthright. May we embody the holiness and the miracles that the Torah attests to. And in that way, may we bring healing and justice to the entire world. And let us all say, Amen.